I've been married to my wife, Kate, for a few years now. From the outside looking in, things might seem normal, even great. But if there's one thing I've learned, it's that nothing about Kate's life has ever been normal. She grew up in a situation that's honestly hard to wrap my head around. Kate was born because her parents, Linda and Mark, gave in to pressure from their own parents, Grace and Harry. Linda and Mark didn't want kids. They had dreams, big ones. They wanted to travel, chase careers, live free. But Grace and Harry were old-fashioned, and apparently, having a child out of wedlock was something they couldn't let slide. From what Kate's told me, Linda and Mark were ready to have an abortion, but Grace and Harry insisted they keep the baby. The catch? Linda and Mark didn't want to raise her. They wanted their freedom. So Grace and Harry stepped in and took over. For the first 6 years of Kate's life, her grandparents were the ones raising her. Linda wasn't mom. She was big sister. That's how they played it. They pretended Kate was just the youngest sibling in a quirky family dynamic. Kate didn't even realize the truth at first. When Grace and Harry started to get older and less capable, they finally made Linda and Mark take responsibility. Kate was 6 when she moved in with them, and it was like stepping into a whole new world, one where she wasn't really wanted. Her parents had no idea how to be parents, and they didn't seem interested in learning. Linda, the woman Kate had called her sister for years, was suddenly supposed to be her mom. Mark, her dad, was basically a stranger to her. Neither of them knew what to do with a little girl, and they didn't seem to care much about figuring it out. From what Kate's told me, they weren't cruel exactly, but they weren't loving either. It was more like they tolerated her presence because they had to. Kate remembers a lot of indifference, a lot of criticism. Nothing she did was ever good enough. If she brought home a drawing from school, they'd point out the mistakes. If she got a B on a test, they'd ask why it wasn't an A. She learned pretty quickly that she wasn't going to get any praise or affection unless she earned it. And even then, it was rare. This shaped so much of who she is now. Kate's one of the most driven people I know. She works harder than anyone else I've ever met. At first, I admired that about her. I thought it was incredible how she turned a tough start into this amazing strength. She always seemed so put together, like she'd overcome her past and come out stronger for it. But the longer I've been with her, the more I've started to notice things that don't quite add up. She has this need to be perfect, to make everything look flawless. At first, I thought it was just ambition, but now I'm not so sure. She hides things, little things, and sometimes I catch her in lies. They're not big lies, at least they don't seem big at the time, but they're there. I used to shrug it off, thinking she just didn't want to admit to something embarrassing or small. But lately, it's been happening more often, and the lies feel different, like they're part of something bigger. There's this feeling I can't shake, like there's a whole other side to Kate that I don't really know. And the more I think about her childhood, about the way she had to fight for even a scrap of affection, the more I wonder if that's part of what's going on now. Maybe she's still fighting for something, even if she doesn't realize it. But the thing is, I don't know if I can keep pretending everything's fine. I don't know if I can ignore the cracks I'm starting to see. Life for Kate only got harder after she moved in with Linda and Mark. Linda, who had pretended to be her older sister for years, was now supposed to be her mom. But instead of stepping into that role with any warmth or care, Linda seemed to resent Kate even more. Linda was relentless in her criticism. She would pick apart everything about Kate, her appearance, her habits, even her achievements. Kate couldn't do anything right in her mother's eyes. If she wore a dress, Linda would say it wasn't flattering. If she tried to style her hair, Linda would find a way to make her feel like it wasn't good enough. Even her natural personality wasn't safe from Linda's jabs. If Kate laughed too loudly, Linda would tell her she was obnoxious. If she was quiet, Linda would accuse her of being weird or antisocial. It didn't stop there. Linda constantly downplayed Kate's abilities. When Kate showed an interest in art, Linda dismissed it as a waste of time. If Kate got a good grade in school, Linda would make a backhanded comment about how it must have been an easy test. Kate told me once that the worst part wasn't even the words, it was the tone. Linda didn't just criticize. She did it with this underlying sense of contempt, as if Kate wasn't just failing but was inherently disappointing just by being herself. Mark, on the other hand, didn't bother to criticize Kate. He didn't do much of anything. He stayed distant, always finding an excuse to be somewhere else. His favorite excuse was work. No matter what was going on at home, he was either too busy or too tired to engage. Kate tried, especially when she was younger. She wanted to spend time with him, to have some kind of relationship. But every attempt was met with coldness. She told me about one time when she was around 8 or 9. She had made a card for Father's Day, spent hours on it, drawing and coloring it in, making it as perfect as she could. When she gave it to Mark, he barely looked at it. He muttered something like, "That's nice," and then set it aside without a second glance. She said that moment stuck with her, not because it was the worst thing he ever did, but because it made her realize how little she mattered to him. The only real support Kate had growing up came from her grandparents, Grace and Harry. Even after she moved in with Linda and Mark, they stayed involved in her life as much as they could. Grace taught Kate how to cook and sew, skills that made her feel capable and independent. Harry, who had been a teacher before he retired, helped her with schoolwork and encouraged her to read. More than anything, they gave Kate something she didn't get anywhere else: kindness. They believed in her when no one else did. Grace used to tell her that she was stronger than she realized, that she could handle anything life threw at her. Harry taught her the value of empathy, saying that understanding and caring for others was one of the greatest strengths a person could have. Even now, when Kate talks about them, there's a softness in her voice that I don't hear when she talks about anyone else. They were her safe haven in a world that often felt cruel and indifferent. But even their support had its limits. They were getting older and their health was starting to decline. They couldn't shield Kate from everything, and they couldn't change the way Linda and Mark treated her. That's the part that breaks my heart the most. Kate had this light in her, this potential to be something amazing, but the people who should have nurtured it were the ones who tried to snuff it out. When Kate was 14, her life changed in a way she hadn't expected. It wasn't some big dramatic moment. It was something small, almost quiet, that grew into something incredible. It all started with her grandmother, Grace, and a pair of knitting needles. Grace had always been good with her hands. She'd sewn quilts, embroidered tablecloths, and knitted sweaters for as long as Kate could remember. One afternoon, she handed Kate a set of knitting needles and some yarn, telling her it was time she learned. At first, Kate was hesitant. She wasn't sure if she'd be any good at it, and a small part of her was afraid of failing. But Grace had a way of making her feel at ease, so she gave it a try. It didn't take long for Kate to fall in love with knitting. There was something soothing about the rhythm of it, the way the yarn slipped through her fingers and slowly turned into something tangible. She started small scarves, potholders, little things like that. But soon, Grace began teaching her more advanced techniques. Together, they made blankets, sweaters, and even intricate lace doilies. For Kate, knitting became more than just a hobby. It was an escape. When things got rough at home, and they often did, she could lose herself in the click of the needles and the patterns forming under her hands. It was one of the few times she felt like she was in control, like she was creating something beautiful out of the chaos around her. Grace suggested they start making things to sell at the local fair. At first, Kate was nervous about putting her work out there. She didn't think anyone would want to buy it. But Grace was insistent, and they spent weeks preparing for the event. When the day of the fair arrived, they set up a booth together, laying out scarves, hats, and blankets in neat rows. To Kate's surprise, people loved her work. By the end of the day, she'd made over $300. For a 14-year-old, it felt like a fortune. But it wasn't just the money that mattered, it was the validation. For the first time, she felt like she was good at something, like she had something to offer the world. That first fair lit a spark in Kate. She threw herself into knitting with even more passion, experimenting with new patterns and designs. Grace helped her set up a social media account to show off her creations, and soon people started reaching out with orders. By the time Kate turned 15, her little hobby had turned into something much bigger. She was making around $2,000 a month from custom orders and sales at fairs. Her social media page had gained a decent following, and people from all over were asking for her work. It wasn't just about the money, though. Knitting gave Kate a sense of purpose. a feeling of independence that she hadn't had before. For the first time, she felt like she didn't have to rely on anyone else. She could carve out her own little space in the world, one stitch at a time. Her success didn't go unnoticed at home. Linda, of course, found ways to criticize it. She'd make snide comments about how knitting wasn't a real skill, or how Kate was wasting her time. Mark, as usual, stayed indifferent, barely acknowledging her achievements. But Kate didn't care. For once, she wasn't looking to them for approval. She had found something that made her happy, something that was hers, and no one could take that away from her. As Kate's knitting success grew, it was only a matter of time before Linda and Mark found out about it. At first, they didn't seem to pay much attention. Kate thought maybe they didn't care, or that they were too wrapped up in their own lives to notice. But when they realized just how much she was earning, everything changed. It started with small comments, little digs that seemed harmless at first. Linda would say things like, "It's so cute how you think this knitting thing is a real job," or, "I hope you're not getting too full of yourself over this little hobby." Mark, as usual, didn't say much, but Kate could feel the shift in the air. Then, one evening, they sat her down at the kitchen table. Linda did most of the talking, her voice sharp and condescending. She said something like, "We've let you have your fun, but it's time to be realistic. You're living under our roof, eating our food, and using our electricity to run this little business of yours. We deserve a share of the profits." Kate couldn't believe what she was hearing. Linda and Mark were demanding all the money she'd worked so hard to earn, claiming it was only fair because they were her parents. When Kate tried to argue, Linda cut her off, saying, "You wouldn't even have this opportunity if it weren't for us. Don't forget that." What made it worse was that Mark finally decided to chime in, not to support Kate but to back up Linda. He didn't raise his voice or get angry. He just calmly said, "We're not asking, Kate. This is how it's going to be." Kate was devastated. She turned to the one person she could trust, her grandmother, Grace. When Kate told her what had happened, Grace was furious. She'd always been Kate's biggest supporter, and there was no way she was going to let Linda and Mark take advantage of her like that. Grace made it clear that Kate's earnings were her own. She even offered to hold on to the money for Kate, keeping it safe so that Linda and Mark couldn't get their hands on it. When Linda found out, all hell broke loose. The fight that followed was one of the worst Kate had ever seen. Linda and Grace went head-to-head, shouting and accusing each other. Linda called Grace an enabler and accused her of turning Kate against her own parents. Grace, in turn, accused Linda of being selfish and manipulative. Mark, as usual, stayed out of it, but his silence only made things worse. After that, everything changed. Linda started cracking down on Kate in ways she never had before. She forbade Kate from visiting Grace, saying it was for her own good. She started monitoring Kate's phone, going through her messages and social media accounts to make sure she wasn't talking to her grandmother. It didn't stop there. Linda imposed strict rules on Kate's movements, refusing to let her leave the house unless it was for school or something she'd approved in advance. Kate felt like a prisoner in her own home. Her world, which had finally started to open up thanks to her knitting, was suddenly shrinking again. The worst part was the isolation. Grace had been Kate's lifeline, the one person who made her feel understood and supported. Without her, Kate felt completely alone. But even in the midst of all this, Kate refused to give up. She kept knitting, even when Linda told her to stop. She kept taking orders, working late at night when everyone else was asleep. And she held on to the hope that one day, she'd be able to break free from all of this. For now, though, she was stuck and the walls were closing in. By the time Kate turned 18, she'd had enough. Years of criticism, control, and manipulation had worn her down, but they hadn't broken her. If anything, they'd made her even more determined to take control of her own life. She knew she couldn't stay under Linda and Mark's roof any longer. It was time to leave. Kate started preparing in secret. She didn't want to give her parents any chance to interfere or sabotage her plans. She quietly gathered her belongings, making sure not to take anything that Linda and Mark had given her. She didn't want to owe them anything, not even a sweater or a piece of jewelry. Everything she packed was hers, things she'd bought with her own money or made with her own hands. When the day came, she didn't make a big scene about it. She waited until Linda and Mark were both out of the house, then loaded up her things and headed straight to her grandmother's place. Grace welcomed her with open arms, just as Kate had known she would. It was the first time in years that Kate felt truly free. Moving in with Grace was a turning point for Kate. It wasn't just about leaving her parents behind, it was about starting fresh. One of the first things she did was open a bank account in her own name. For years, Linda had controlled every penny Kate earned. But now that was over. Every dollar she made from her knitting business would be hers and hers alone. Next, Kate restored her social media accounts. Linda had made her delete them after the big fight over her earnings. But now, she was back online and ready to rebuild her brand. It didn't take long for her followers to find her again. Orders started pouring in, and within a few months, Kate's business was thriving once more. But it wasn't just her business that was taking off. Kate had always been a hard worker, and her efforts in school had paid off in a big way. She'd earned a full scholarship to a prestigious university, a scholarship that covered $60,000 a year. For the first time in her life, she could focus entirely on her studies without worrying about how she would pay for them. The scholarship wasn't just a financial relief. It was a validation of everything Kate had worked so hard for. It was proof that she was capable, that she had value, and that she could succeed on her own terms. Living with Grace gave Kate the stability she needed to balance her studies and her business. Grace was her biggest cheerleader, always there to offer advice or a kind word when Kate needed it. Together, they created a home filled with warmth and encouragement, a stark contrast to the cold, critical environment Kate had left behind. Kate told me once that moving out wasn't just about escaping her parents. It was about proving to herself that she could stand on her own. And she did. She didn't just survive. She thrived. Of course, Linda didn't take it well. She tried to guilt-trip Kate, accusing her of being ungrateful and selfish. Mark, true to form, stayed silent, leaving Linda to do all the talking. But by then, Kate had learned to tune them out. Their opinions no longer held any power over her. For the first time in her life, Kate felt like she was in control of her own destiny. She had her freedom, her business, and her education. She was building a future on her own terms, and no one could take that away from her. College was a new chapter in Kate's life, and for the first time, she felt like she could breathe. Being away from her parents and starting fresh in an environment where no one knew her past gave her a sense of freedom she'd never experienced before. Kate made friends quickly, something she hadn't been able to do growing up. In her parents' house, she'd been so tightly controlled that it was hard to form any meaningful relationships. But in college, it was different. She was surrounded by people who shared her interests and values, and for the first time, she felt like she belonged. One of those new friendships turned into something more. She met Josh in one of her classes, a laid-back, funny guy who seemed to take an immediate interest in her. First, Kate was hesitant. She wasn't used to opening up to people, especially in a romantic way. But Josh was patient, and over time, he broke through her walls. They'd been dating for 4 months now, and Kate was happier than she ever thought she could be in a relationship. Her business was also thriving. With her social media accounts restored, Kate's customer base had grown even larger than before. She was getting orders from all over the country, and even a few from overseas. Her work was in demand, and she was doing her best to keep up with it all. That's where Grace came in. She'd offered Kate a small studio space to work out of. Just an old room in her house that they cleared out and repurposed, but it was perfect. Kate and Grace spent hours there working on orders together. It became their shared project, a way to bond while building something Kate could be proud of. But the support didn't stop there. As Kate's relatives on her grandparents' side learned about everything she'd been through with Linda and Mark, they rallied around her. Many of them had suspected that things weren't right in that house, but they hadn't known the full extent of it until Kate opened up. Her relatives wanted to help however they could. Some of them spread the word about her business, recommending her work to friends and coworkers. Others placed orders themselves, making sure to leave glowing reviews online. It wasn't just about the business. It was about showing Kate that she had a family that cared about her, even if her parents didn't. For Kate, This support was overwhelming in the best way. She'd spent so much of her life feeling isolated and unwanted, and now she was surrounded by people who genuinely cared about her success and happiness. It wasn't something she'd ever expected, but she was deeply grateful for it. Between her studies, her relationship with Josh, and her growing business, Kate was busier than ever. But for the first time in her life, she wasn't just surviving. She was thriving. Every now and then, she'd think about Linda and Mark. She didn't hate them exactly, but she didn't feel much for them either. They were just there, a part of her past that she no longer let define her. She was building a life on her own terms, surrounded by people who truly supported her, and she wasn't looking back. Kate's life had completely transformed, and for the first time, she felt at peace. The shadow of Linda and Mark, which had loomed over her for so long, finally began to fade. When word of their treatment of Kate spread through the family and beyond, the public backlash was harsh. Extended relatives, neighbors, and even old acquaintances started to distance themselves from Linda and Mark. People didn't hold back, openly criticizing them for their cruelty and manipulation. For a couple so concerned about appearances, this was unbearable. Rather than face the fallout, Linda and Mark decided to leave the country. Kate didn't know where they went, and honestly, she didn't care. She hadn't heard from them in months, and she didn't expect to. Their attempts to guilt-trip or control her had failed, and they seemed to realize there was no place for them in her life anymore. With her parents gone, Kate felt a weight lift off her shoulders. She no longer had to worry about their interference or their toxic presence. She could finally focus on the life she was building, free from their influence. Financial independence was something Kate had achieved years ago, but now it felt even more meaningful. Her knitting business was thriving, bringing in a steady income that allowed her to live comfortably. She had the freedom to set her own hours, take on projects she was passionate about, and even save for the future. What made it even better was that she truly loved what she did. Each piece she created was a reflection of her skill and creativity, and knowing that people appreciated her work brought her a deep sense of fulfillment. She was doing what she loved, and she was doing it on her own terms. Kate's personal life was just as rewarding. Grace remained her rock, always there with words of wisdom or a cup of tea when Kate needed it. Their bond was unshakable, and Kate couldn't imagine her life without her grandmother's love and support. Her circle of friends from college had become like a second family to her. They were the kind of people who celebrated her wins and lifted her up during tough times. And then there was Josh. He was patient, kind, and supportive, always encouraging her to chase her dreams. Their relationship had grown stronger over time, and Kate felt like she'd finally found someone she could trust with her heart. Looking back, Kate couldn't believe how far she'd come. The girl who once felt like she had no place in the world was now standing tall, surrounded by love and success. She'd built a life that was entirely her own, one filled with purpose, joy, and the kind of freedom she'd always dreamed of. Kate didn't dwell on the past anymore. Linda and Mark were just a chapter in her story, one that she'd closed for good. Her focus was on the future, on her business, her studies, her relationships, and the endless possibilities ahead of her. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was living. And for Kate, that was the happiest ending she could have ever imagined.